my mother was advised to go to the mortuary. And there was a mortuary, a temporary mortuary in the crypt of St John's Church, which is next door to the station entrance. And she walked in there and there were rows and rows of bodies, and she walked up and down looking for her mother. And she couldn't find her, so she went out and thought, well, she went to go out and thought, you know, thank goodness my mother's not here. But the lady that was in charge said, I think you should just look again. So she went back to look again, and then she discovered her mother, and the reason she hadn't recognised her was because my grandmother apparently had jet black hair, but it had turned completely white, and we think that must have been the fright of everything that had happened to her. My mother was left with partial paralysis of her face. But she was alive, and the little boy she was holding wasn't. I grew up knowing that there had been the Bethnal Green Tube disaster, but I didn't really know the details. I didn't know what had happened, other than that her nephew, that everybody loved, had died in this, and so had her mother. It was never really talked about, and yet her sister lived in the same house as us for most of our lives, most of their lives, and I suppose they both knew what happened, so there was no need to talk about it. You know, it's only in recent years that I've felt, you don't know how anyone can live with that. It's really very, very difficult. And she said that every night of her life when she laid down, she could hear the screams and the cries, and that never ever left her. And it was only on the 50th anniversary when I really discovered what had happened. There'd been the odd references to the Bethnal Green Tube disaster throughout my life, but nothing specific. I didn't really know any details. I didn't know how many people had died. I didn't know any of the circumstances in which my mother had found herself there. But then we heard that the local council was organising a memorial service for the 50th anniversary at St John's Church. So I went with my mother to the memorial service where everybody's name was read out, and she was interviewed afterwards by various people, local journalists. But just before the service, she'd been interviewed for the Times newspaper and also on radio. And it was then that I learnt the full details of what had happened, because she was able to talk to the journalists because they were strangers. And she said that there'd been obviously no counselling at all during the war. People were just told, stiff upper lip, get on with your life. But she said if only she'd had some kind of counselling, maybe she would have come to terms with it before. But it must have been quite cathartic to talk to strangers about it and give all the full details of what had happened to her. And it was really the first time that I knew the full horror of what had happened. I'd never known all those details before then. When you think back now, 50 years of living with it must have been horrendous. And so that's one of the reasons, obviously, why I feel that we should have a proper fitting memorial to this terrible tragedy, the worst civilian disaster of the Second World War. And it's why I'm working hard to help the Stairway to Heaven Memorial Trust to try and raise enough money for this.